So how can you come up with good ideas? One concept is the idea that we're all swimming in a sea of ideas. An idea is not normally something you come up with yourself. You're just sitting there and suddenly a light bulb moment and an idea comes out. Usually ideas come from combining or manipulating or tweaking the sea of ideas we all swim in. So there are so many smart people out there in the world and they're all producing ideas, and these ideas are all floating around, and most research involves combining them. We've seen this for Brian Schmidt and for Matthew Collis's work. It's also important for my own work that you're talking to other people, listening to ideas, and not just in your own speciality. Often ideas from different specialities or even outside of science can be enormously useful. And thinking about these things and linking them together and playing with them in your brain is an absolutely crucial skill. All the evidence shows that people who work entirely by themselves are not productive scientists. You can maybe have to work by yourself, but you absolutely need to be talking and listening and exchanging ideas, because no one brain can duplicate the effect of millions of brains out there. So you're in a sea of ideas and you've always got to listen to other people, tell them your own ideas, exchange ideas, think about it, read the journals, check what other scientists are producing on social media. This is absolutely essential. Sorry to all the introverts out there, but this is essential. But there's a limit to it. If you spend all your time networking and listening and not thinking for yourself, then you can succumb to groupthink. If you're thinking the same way that everybody else in the field is thinking, then you won't be able to get your edge and to actually be a productive researcher. So you've got to keep very much in touch with what everyone else is doing and constantly exchanging ideas, because you won't get anywhere without that. But you've also got to maintain a certain degree of independence. So you've got to look at what other people have said and say, maybe if you put this together in a way they haven't thought of, or maybe everyone else is going down this path, but surely this idea they've got also allows us to go down that path. So you've got to ring the changes on what everyone else is doing. And this is a really difficult problem. There's actually a lot of research that shows that this correct level of interconnectedness, not too high, not too low, is important in all forms of life. That basically anything worth doing is done collaboratively and usually in large teams, but teams too easily succumb to groupthink, where they all think the same thing and don't challenge everybody else. So you need teams where people are still thinking for themselves. And there's a vast literature about how to achieve this in, for example, business teams. There are huge numbers of examples from government and business where everyone tells the leader what he wants to hear, and they all go down the same path and off a cliff into disaster. So you need an interesting balance. You need to be swimming in the sea of ideas, getting lots of ideas to and from each other, but also you've got to think for yourself and maybe exploit the weaknesses in other people's thinking or some unique background. How do you do that? How do you think differently? Well, it can be you have a different background to most others in your field. This is probably an advantage of double degrees or coming from a different country. I think one of the strengths of research at ANU is that most of the staff here have come from universities in different countries, bringing slightly different approaches. Certainly a lot of my own teaching is informed by things that happened in different countries that aren't normally done in Australia. Or you could have a different background. For example, often being a foreigner, or maybe having done a double degree or a degree in something else. I actually wanted to do humanities for a long time, and I think that gives me an edge because most scientists have only ever been scientists and they don't have so much of a humanities point of view towards things. And there are many other tweaks like this that allow you to think a bit differently from other people. The classic example, Think Different, was the logo advertising slogan for Apple. And Steve Jobs is famous for doing this, and he was definitely someone who thought differently, possibly because he had a bit of a hippie background and lots of meditation and yoga and drugs and things like this made him think rather differently from many other people, but nonetheless he was still deeply connected and talked to everybody else. So it's tricky. One way is to think a lot from first principles. So when people are saying, let's research this, why? Why are we researching that? Oh, because. But why is that? Keep going further and further back and keep asking why, until you get right back to the fundamental principles. And Does this really make sense? Is there another way to do it? And go down to a fundamental level. This is something that I see many, many young researchers fail at. Everyone else in their field is working on a particular thing in a particular way, and so they work on the same thing in a particular way. And that's fine for a PhD, but you won't get to become an independent researcher by that. You've got to do something a bit different. And you generally won't be thanked for it. Let me give you an example when I'm a bit painful from my own career. In the early 2000s, up to then I'd been researching galaxies in the early universe, and I'd been very successful at that. But we were in a situation where other countries had access to giant telescopes which were very good at this, and Australia did not. So I was getting less and less competitive, not necessarily for any fault of my own, but simply because I was up against researchers in other countries that had better facilities for this particular project. So I was looking for a project that would work better for someone in Australia with Australian telescope facilities. And I decided that rather than doing galaxies, maybe I could look at planetary science, in particular study comets. I'd long been interested in comets, I'd read papers about them, and I thought there was some very interesting work to be done on comets. And this was, for me, a big change of research field. Normally people stay in the same research field their entire career, and here was me trying to change it because I felt that my existing research field was hitting a dead end for a researcher in Australia. Now this was probably a mistake because people in the new research field were not really happy to have an outsider, because these outsiders all talk the wrong language, they don't know the right people. You'll find a lot of objection for competition. I felt that my advantage was that people in the planetary science field had a particular way of doing things, whereas I came from a different background, extragalactic astronomy, and we had a different way of doing things. The planetary scientists, most of the money in that field comes from contracts for NASA to build spacecraft, so they were very focused on dropping a probe on a planet and studying it, and they were less good at using small and medium telescopes to do big surveys, whereas for extragalactic astronomy that was our bread and butter. So that was my edge, and indeed it was a very productive edge. I was able to use the fact that I was interested in things that most people in the field were not interested in to show that what everyone thought about the number of comets in the comet belt, the Oort cloud, was totally wrong, and in fact there were 10 times fewer. And I had endless trouble. My paper was rejected multiple times. People wrote nasty things about me in conferences. I was definitely not liked for this. It turned out that my result was correct, but I got so burnt out by the whole thing I've not worked in the field ever since. So this is an example. If you try and do something a bit different, jump fields and something, it's going to be very hard. People in the new field won't like you. You may have an edge because you've got a background and an approach that's different from everybody else, but don't expect to be liked for it. The final point is the necessity of looking at the big picture. And again, this is something I see a lot of researchers go wrong. This is, for example, the most common way people lose marks in honours and masters presentations. You might have done a project to investigate the use of the laser in this particular technique, but you've got to think, yes, you've spent the last 3 years of your life investigating this narrow technique, how you do this, and everyone else in your research group is doing the same thing, and they all talk about the whole thing. But you've always got to stop and ask the big picture, why does it matter to anybody else? For your PhD, it doesn't matter if you're just down a tunnel hole particularly, but when you get to later stages in your career, when you've actually got to come up with your own research, you've got to think, does this actually matter to anybody outside the field? Would another astronomer in a different field care about this? How about your grandmother? Brian Schmidt always talks about his idea of whenever coming up with a new research project is, what would my grandmother think about this? Is it so specialised she wouldn't care? Is it going to make her life better? Is it going to interest her? If it doesn't, you should maybe think twice about doing it. And once again, to go back to first principles, does it really make sense? And again, it's very easy to be working in a research group with a whole bunch of other people who think that your narrow area is really important and lose sight of the big picture.